very close. I just forgot the part I always forget. That's great. Okay. So, I think you said you knew Larry White. Yeah. He's about 85 in that video. I love particularly when he says, when I retire next year, what he's planning to do, because he is working nearly full-time on a curriculum for the Department of Corrections about how to appropriately care for lifers who are old in the prisons. So I know that there's nobody who came to this lecture who isn't aware of the fact that the world's population is growing older, and that concurrent to the world's population growing older, the proportion of people who are children is decreasing dramatically. And in fact, just about now, I don't know if you feel these two lines crossing over your head, but just about now is when the two lines cross and the proportion of the population that's over 65 is now larger than the proportion that's under 5. And those two lines will exponentially, literally exponentially, not hyperbolically, diverge from now until the foreseeable future, if the overall course of the world goes as we expected. And there's a lot of people who treat this fact as if it's a kind of emergency. And it's kind of a bizarre thing to treat as an emergency. First of all, because emergencies are things that were unforeseeable. And demography, if it's nothing if not foreseeable, I mean, it's a little, like a glacier just sort of coming at you, plodding along. And if you aren't looking at it, sorry, but it's not like it's not foreseeable. But that's not really the important part. The important part is, how come it's good to be young and bad to be old? How come it's a big problem that there are now more older people than younger people? Why do we make the assumption that that's a bad thing? And you're all saying, well, geez, this woman's like supposed to be a professor and stuff, and she's never heard of the dependency ratio, and she doesn't understand that stuff. Of course I have. It's just only it's wrong. I've heard of it. But it's based on a series of faulty assumptions. And since it's not the center of what I want to talk about, I just want to pull one thread in the dependency ratio, which will remind many of the people in the audience how crazy it is. So the dependency ratio is the relationship of people who are doing quote-unquote productive work to the people who aren't doing quote-unquote productive work. But the rub, one of the many rubs, but a rub, is how we define productive work. And there's some really big issues with that. And the one that I like to remind us is that having and raising those children that we value so highly is not productive work. Women's work is not productive work. Household work is not productive work. Literally producing the next generation is not productive work. And so if you have an equation that is based on that premise, I'm not going worry about it. And instead, you have the opportunity to think about what happens if we have the ability to value all the young people that we have and to invest appropriately in their education and well-being, because we have so many older people available to do the working and the supporting and the teaching to be able to do that. And so maybe we're entering now a different time in the history of people where we have the resources and the ability to take all of that to be the case. It seems unlikely to me that that would be a terrible thing for the world, but we'll have to see. So now, if you could just roll these little photos, I'm gonna talk very quickly about sort of some setup stuff so that I can talk slowly about the new stuff. So whether or not, so these are some more of the wonderful people in Exceeding Expectations. So these are photos of New Yorkers, all over 81, some of them substantially over 81, and just doing the things they do. If you notice someone and want to know more about them, feel free to ask me, because I know them each very well and can explain what was going on in that picture and before it and after it and so forth. But whether or not these people, that line, is a crisis or an opportunity depends partly on how we age, right? And so I want us to be honest with ourselves for a minute about how primitively we think about that in our deepest reptilian brains, not our big, fancy, sophisticated brains, but our just. And so one thing we think is that, right? And then we think, good genes, right? Good genes, a particular favor. Then there's virtue. If you live well, you age well. And then we say, come on, now we're not so primitive. It's about good medical care. Right? Better medical care. And then it's about living right, knowing how to live. And it's also about our virtue when you think about it, but we won't. But of course, one of the things about all that is that those are all individual characteristics, all actions that individuals take. And we need to differentiate between living long and living well, right? Because that's sort of two different things. And so then, what are the predictors of living long? Living in a developing country, having a higher level of education obtained as a child. Further education isn't predictive of that. This is because education is running as a proxy for class here. Gender, we know which one, is predictive of living long. We used to believe that being a first-generation Latinx in this country was predictive of living long, and we've now got much more nuanced and complicated information about that. Turns out being a first-generation Latinx whose skin looks more like mine is predictive of living long. Perfect. And being in good health is predictive of living long. But notice, this is another list of things you can't do anything about. So what is this? This is epidemiological biologic description. It does not help us to create a better world. It's just descriptive of a very flawed world that exists. One of these lists, right? So to age well, that is to live the bulk of your life in good health, in functional ability. We'll talk a lot more about that. Again, you've got education, which is class. So a higher level of education before the age of 24, call it. Exercise, meeting your basic needs, so that is having food, clothing, and shelter, shockingly contributes to aging well, just as it contributes to living well. And then we start to get some more interesting things. Having purpose and engagement, having something about which you are passionate. Having a social network that's meaningful to you. Your attitude to aging and wealth. Again, these are things at the level of the individual. So I want to open our lens now to some sociological and policy and societal thought, because that's kind of where we need to play if we're going to change the experience of people more than one at a time, right? If we're going to change the conditions of aging. And so I want to take up this new-ish construct called cumulative disadvantage, which of course also is cumulative advantage. And let me first say that this is completely a conceptual diagram. This is not a chart of the epidemiology of anyone. And you need to think of it as one cohort. So all these people down there at age 0, those are all the people that were born in 1945, okay? I picked an arbitrary year, okay? So that this is not birth over a long period of time. This is 1 year's birth, okay? And the x-axis is boring old chronological age. Nothing fancy, not some elegant construct of functional age or anything. It's just, years on Earth. And the y-axis is an imaginary perfect measure of functional ability. We're not going to get into all the imperfections of every existing measure of functional ability function, which means it's your functional ability due to the capacities that you have inside yourself and the capacities in the world that you're able to marshal on your own behalf, okay? So, my ability to climb stairs is intrinsic, an elevator is extrinsic, and they're good substitutes for one another. And if I have one or the other, I can live on the 3rd floor. If I have neither, not so much. But one of the, so that's intrinsic and extrinsic. And then I want to call your attention to this big fat band called the disability threshold, which is not a line because it is movable, okay? So the disability threshold is a conceptual thing under which you're no longer functionally independent, and over which you remain functionally independent. So consider the infant a perfect instance of a being who is totally below the disability threshold, absolutely dependent for everything, without someone to feed it, to change it, to turn it over, to dress it. It is a blob of protoplasm, right? You can't do a goddamn thing at first, and then, you know, they progress quickly. But that is below the disability threshold. We fortunately rapidly rise above the disability threshold, and we can walk around and we can express our needs, and we can reach for things, and we can feed ourselves, and, you know, we can get dressed and go to school, and almost everybody rises above it very quickly. You know, the exception are people born with very significant disabilities at birth, which is a tiny proportion of the population globally. It's really highly unusual to be born unable to grow. At some point in young adulthood, what point in young adulthood we hit our zenith sort of depends on whether you're including cognitive development and the development of common sense and so forth. If you're talking principally about sort of physical prowess, it's younger. But if you're also talking about sort of having the brains you were born with to be able to make reasonable decisions and so forth, it's later. But we hit our zenith, and then of course what's important is that the lines then diverge, and they diverge dramatically, and they diverge rapidly, and if anything, this graphic understates the amount of the divergence. And the less advantaged members of our society rapidly age to below the level of independent members of our society, continue to thrive, to develop, to learn, to produce, to be productive, to grow. Looking around at my many colleagues in the room who we're old, you know, and we're doing fine. Sometimes we even make a contribution, I think. And there is nothing inherently biologically different to start with between the more and the less advantaged people. But there is a process of not just disparity, right? Disparity or inequity, doesn't matter what you call it. That is the difference. We're talking about the growth in difference, okay? Cumulative disadvantage. We're talking about the fact that old people are the most heterogeneous age. These guys, remarkably similar. None of them can do anything. Like, there isn't a baby that pops out, sits up, and says, "How ya doing?" You know, it just doesn't go that way, right? And similarly, even though it seems like it's never going to happen, there are very few 4-year-olds who don't use the toilet and sit at the table and feed themselves. You know, those ages are functionally quite homogeneous. And even though there's going to be a divergence in learning once people get to school, there isn't a big divergence in functioning, in fundamental life functioning. Poor kids don't walk less well than rich kids, thank God, you know, something that stays sort of even. But literally, poor older people walk less well than rich older people very soon. And what is that about? Why? Why is that? What's going on? What's going on? How come poor people walk less well at about 40 than more well-to-do people? Think about what's on your feet. They're expensive. The shoes that support our feet after we've been on them for a while are very expensive. And if you don't have the money for these, $300 boots that look exactly like plain old $50 boots, but only their insides are a little special, what are you wearing? Slippers. That's what you're wearing. You're wearing Crocs. You're wearing slippers. You're wearing flip-flops. Why? Because that's what fits on your feet. And if you're wearing Crocs and slippers and flip-flops, you're only out and about in the city of New York for about 7 months of the year. For about 5 months of the year, you're not outside at all, okay? Around my building at 119th Street and 3rd Avenue, the streets are empty today during the day. People are gonna come home from work at night and there'll be people around. But during the day, the people that are around aren't out because slippers aren't good for this time. And that, of course, is just one mechanical material thing. It is also the case that the comorbidities of middle age and the second half of life hit very much earlier by class and then progress very much faster by class. So, the arthritis, the sciatica, I'm just going with more mobility because I started with mobility, but we can use anything. And you take all the, the bunions, the crutches, the crotches, and they're much worse. And why are they much worse? Well, they're not just much worse because you can't buy fancy shoes. They're also much worse because you're more likely to have done more of your work, more on your feet, and more with your body in ways that it may or may not have been built to do, okay? Because we're not talking about being virtuous hunter-gatherers or farmers in the fields. We're talking about being bent double over strawberry plants for as long as that harvest is, or cleaning my same office building that I was talking about before, the neighborhood with a bunch of toxic chemicals and gets themselves contorted in a whole lot of positions and breathes a whole lot of chemicals and walks, around and empties the garbage cans 48 times a day. I mean, I don't understand. But the entire life course is different by the opportunities that we have. And the whole life course makes old age. We are those Russian dolls. We carry inside of us everything that's ever happened to us. It doesn't unhappen. It doesn't leave our bodies just because we grow up. So, and it contributes to the allostatic load that we carry. It contributes to our vulnerabilities, our emotional vulnerabilities, our mental vulnerabilities, our physical vulnerabilities. And we can't help that. Many of us develop amazing resilience as individuals and are weathered and because of experiences or despite experiences, but it's true. And communities similarly grow resilience, but none of that makes all those experiences gone. They're there, and they're imprinted in our body. And this is a model that suggests that aging is caused by social factors that are then expressed biologically, rather than that whips causality in aging. So this is saying that the biology is expressing people's social experience. So, okay, that's true. We still have not answered whether this idea of cumulative disadvantage has any merit. Everything I've just talked about is all about disparity or inequity. We're all just talking. I was only talking about difference. All of that, as you know, compelling as it sounded, it was still, or maybe I hope it's not, but it was still about difference, not about the increase in difference. So now, these kind of watches, which tells you everything but what time it is. Holy shit. That's terrible. I have 10 minutes to do the most important stuff. Okay, so you have to tell me the truth. I have 2 more fabulous videos. They're much shorter than the others. And I have these big questions about the cumulative disadvantage stuff. Should we split the difference and have 1 more video instead of 2 more videos so we can talk about ideas a little bit? And should we have it at the end or should we have it now?
Split it and do it now.
Split it and do it now. Okay. All right, you're right.